The first part of our ancient testimony comes from the Gospel of John, chapter 13. This is part of Jesus' farewell conversation with his disciples. Little children, I'm with you for a little while longer. You will look for me, but as I told the Jewish leaders, I will tell you now, where I'm going, you cannot come. I give you a new commandment. Love one another. Just as I have loved you, so you also must love one another. This is how everyone will know that you are my disciples, when you love each other. Simon Peter said to Jesus, "Lord, where are you going?" Jesus answered, "Where I am going, you can't follow me now, but you will follow later." Peter asked, "Lord, why can't I follow you? I will give up my life for you." Jesus replied, "Will you give up your life for me? I assure you that you will deny me 3 times before the rooster crows." Contrary to popular opinion, the disciples of Jesus were no heroes, but that's the best thing about them. They were so relatable. When Jesus told them to feed the 4,000, they complained they didn't have enough resources. When Mary of Bethany washed Jesus' feet in an extravagant act of devotion and anointed them with expensive perfume, Judas, like any good progressive, protested that the money should better have been used for poverty reduction and social justice programs. James and John angled for the top positions in Jesus' cabinet. None of them ever really understood Jesus' mission or purpose until they saw it in the light of Easter. Judas betrayed him. Peter denied even knowing him. And in the end, they all abandoned him. These disciples, the ones whom Jesus had handpicked to follow him, were no less petty, jealous, fearful, and faithless than anyone else. And yet, against all odds, their movement survived. The church has survived somehow to this day. And Jesus continues to rise in his people. What do you make of the fact that the first community gathered around Jesus was a community of profound love, as well as painful betrayal? Does it make you feel depressed or hopeful? Or maybe some of both? If we're doing it right, reading the scriptures can be like holding up a mirror that can help us see ourselves more clearly. As imperfect as it is, the Bible helps us see ourselves refracted through the light of God's love. It helps us to see ourselves not in our small ego-bound selves, but in our whole selves, because it tells the story of our origin and our destiny in God. And when we catch a glimpse of our whole selves, loved and forgiven by God, sometimes it helps us to be a little more patient, a little more forgiving, and a little more loving, both with ourselves and with others. Judas' betrayal and Peter's denial fractured that community that had gathered around Jesus. And yet we know it wasn't the last word. Somehow that community, not every member of it, but the community as a whole came back together And they demonstrated their love for one another, so much so that this was what was said of them by the non-Christians around them. See how those Christians love one another. Somehow, in the light of the resurrection, they realized the impossible possibility of human transformation. They saw that change is always possible by the grace of God. A few months ago, our consultant from the Center for Progressive Renewal, Reverend Cameron Trimble, shared with us the possibility of living as a transformed community. If you were there when we gathered with her in May, you might remember that she talked about triangles that people can get stuck in. They happen everywhere. Churches, families, places of work. And these are triangles that can destroy community. Triangles in which there always have to be victims and perpetrators and rescuers. But the good news she shared with us is that these triangles can be transformed. We can grow towards health and healing. We can transform them through rigorous honesty with ourselves and others. We can transform them through acts of audacious forgiveness, even as we uphold standards of loving and accountable behavior. And we can decide that instead of remaining a victim, we're going to be co-creators with God of our own destiny. Jesus himself showed us the way. Even as I have loved you, he said, so you are to love one another. How did that fragile and flawed group of people gathered around Jesus become the resilient force that changed the world? Only through love. A love so great the grave could not contain it. A love that makes no victims and never bullies. Most importantly, a love that springs not from our own broken hearts, but from the eternal wellspring of the source of love that we know in God through Jesus, always flowing and always free. Amen and blessed be.
The second part of our ancient testimony follows the disciples beyond Jesus' crucifixion. Jesus appeared again to the disciples, this time at the Tiberias Sea. And this is how the story unfolded. Simon Peter, Thomas, nicknamed Twin, Nathanael from Cana, the brothers Zebedee, and the two disciples were together. Simon Peter announced, "I'm going fishing." The rest of them replied, "I guess we're going with you." They went out and got in the boat, but they caught nothing that night. When the sun came up, Jesus was standing on the beach, but they didn't recognize him. Jesus spoke to them. "Good morning. Did you catch anything for breakfast?" They answered, "No." He said, "Throw the net off the right side of the boat and see what happens." They did what he said, and all of a sudden there were so many fish, they weren't strong enough to reel that net in. Then the disciple that Jesus loved said to Peter, "It's the Master!" When Simon Peter realized it was the Master, he threw on some clothes because he'd been working in his skivvies, and he dove into the sea. The other disciples came in by boat, but they weren't far from land, 100 yards or so, and they were pulling that big, full net of fish behind them. When they got out of the boat, they saw that a fire was laid out, and fish and bread were already cooking on it. And Jesus said to them, "Bring some of the fish you've just caught. I'll fry them up for you this morning." Simon Peter joined them and helped them pull the net to shore, and they counted 153 big fish. And even with all those fish, the net hadn't ripped. Jesus said, "By this time, breakfast is ready." Not one of the disciples dared ask, "Who are you?" They knew it was the Master. Jesus then took the bread and gave it to them, and he did the same thing with the fish. This was now the third time that Jesus had shown himself alive to the disciples since being raised from the dead. After breakfast, Jesus was sitting across from Simon Peter, and they caught each other's eye. And Jesus said, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" "Yes, Master, you know I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my lambs." And then there was silence between them, and that catching of the eye again. And Jesus asked a second time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" "Yes, Master, you know I love you." Jesus said, "Then shepherd my sheep." And then there was silence again. But Jesus never looked away from Peter's face. He said again, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Well, Peter was upset by now. Peter said, "For the third time you've asked me, do you love me?" "Well, Master, you know everything there is to know. You've got to know that I love you." And Jesus said, "Feed my sheep." Can you imagine this? The disciples have lost their best friend, their master, their teacher. They are despondent after Jesus' crucifixion. They all had scattered, but somehow, as we human beings do, they also felt abandoned, even though they knew they had abandoned Jesus. And they're afraid. So they go back to their old way of life, the way they had led life before they met Jesus. They were fishermen then, and that's what they were good at, and they didn't seem to have the resilience to carry on what they'd been training to do with Jesus. In John's Gospel, Jesus knew that this would happen, because Jesus knows everything. Peter and the others would let their grief and shame and their embarrassment weigh them down to the point where they couldn't do anything. They couldn't even catch real fish, let alone the people that he was training them to bring together. So Jesus met them on the beach in the early morning, and he had a fire burning to welcome them even before he called out to them. I think this is such a great metaphor to show us how available God is, how available God's grace is to all of us. It's here among us, even before we know we need it. When we're looking for the God who forgives and makes all things new, all we have to do is turn around and find out that God's been there all along, waiting for us. And more to the point, God is there directing and guiding. The story says that the disciples take the stranger's advice. They don't even know who this guy is who says, put your net out on the right side of the boat. And you know they had to be grumbling inside their heads. Why should I do this? Haven't caught anything all night, not going to catch anything now, but what the heck? And they put their net in and it's overflowing. What they realized is there was something familiar about that voice, something familiar about that guiding. And when they got in sync with God's creative energy, they felt that old flow, the way they had felt it when Jesus was with them. And they recognized that he was present. This Jesus, the one who always told them that he was going to be there to reveal God to them. And what about that crazy interchange, that intense interchange between Peter and Jesus? It's there to tie together and bring completion to all the chaos and mixed emotions that they had at his crucifixion. Jesus had predicted particularly that Peter would betray him 3 times, and we know that happened, right? So Peter, Jesus' favorite, was now carrying around not big nets full of fish, but big sack of shame. At that early morning post-resurrection picnic on the beach, when Jesus looks Peter in the eye and asks him 3 times, "Do you love me?" And Peter swears his love 3 times. It's like the reversing of a spell of grief and shame. Like Jesus says to Peter, it's like, "Put that sack down, Peter. I'm making all things new. Look at me. Now, go to work." Peter is freed up by that exchange and fully enrolled again in the work of feeding lambs and caring for sheep, not fishing anymore. This is what's available to us when we're willing to let go of our pain from having been hurt. When we're willing to let God take the shame of our having been the cause of pain for someone else. When we do that, we have an opportunity to just let go of it all, to declare our love and commitment once again for moving forward into the future. This is an invitation to us and a promise. To be ready to receive God's grace, we must recognize that God doesn't hold on to our grief, our pain, our shame, and God isn't holding that over our heads. When we are ready to honestly name it and release it, we are then ready to carry on the work that's been the church's for generations, feeding and nurturing God's people on the streets, in our schools, in our prisons, in our workplaces. Amen.